I'm very pleased to be invited to what I consider to be a very timely Sustainability Leaders Forum. I participated last month in an event which was very stark. I was asked as chair of the elders to go along to the unveiling of the Doomsday Clock, which is an annual event since 1947. I was asked to go along with my deputy, Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General. He was my boss for 3 mandates, and now he's my deputy, and a very, very supportive deputy, I must say. We were there also with Jerry Brown, the former governor of California. And the clock moved 2 years ago to 2 minutes to midnight. It didn't move in 2019. And so the question was, would it move? And it did, the wrong way. It moved to 100 seconds to midnight, which is the worst it has ever been. In all the Cold War fears, it was not so bad. We didn't come as near as 100 seconds. So that's a very stark reminder. And it's 3 things. It's the nuclear issue, which is unraveling, getting worse. The agreements are being undone between Russia and the United States. They're weaponizing with even hypersonic weapons. It's climate that is getting worse, and our actions are not enough to even address the fact that it's getting worse. And the third thing is disruptive technologies, cyber war, the fact that artificial intelligence might be able to control some of these weapons, including even potentially nuclear weapons. And I want to just refer to what the atomic scientists said, because they're the ones. It's the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that determines whether the clock will move. And I wanted to refer to what they said about climate. They said, public awareness of the climate crisis grew over the course of 2019, largely because of mass protests by young people around the world. Just the same, governmental action on climate change will fall far short of meeting the challenge at hand. At UN climate meetings last year, national delegates made fine speeches but put forward few concrete plans to further limit the carbon dioxide emissions that are disrupting Earth's climate. This limited political response came during a year when the effects of man-made climate change were manifested by one of the warmest years on record, extensive wildfires, and quicker than expected melting of glacial ice. And then later on, they went on to explain this in more detail. So it is time for an emergency response, and I gather that's your overall theme, an emergency response for business, because I think that's really basically spot on. You know, it's very serious. I don't talk about climate change anymore. I talk about the climate crisis, the climate emergency, or my preference, climate justice. Because from the beginning of understanding the issue, I was aware of the injustice of climate change. Actually, there are a lot of injustices involved. The first injustice was the injustice I saw in African countries when I was working there, because it was the poorest people who are not responsible, who don't drive cars, who don't do major manufacturing, haven't central heating, etc. They were the ones most affected. When I started in 2003, 2004, 2005, and I just was struck that I hadn't understood when I was serving in the UN as High Commissioner for Human Rights. Another part of the UN was dealing with climate change. I didn't make the connection that climate change undermines the most important human rights, rights to food, water, health, education, and even life itself, and drives people from their homes. So I'm glad to say that even when I established my foundation on climate justice in 2010, it was something of a taboo subject. I was actually warned not to call it the Foundation on Climate Justice, but I couldn't do otherwise because it was the injustice that had affected me so deeply. And now I'm glad to say it's the call in the street. Even business now talks about climate justice. More and more governments talk about climate justice. It's a concept and language that different actors in the world of development, climate change, and human rights coalesce around to find commonalities rather than differences. And now that school children worldwide are striking for Fridays for Future, we're all becoming aware of another injustice, the intergenerational injustice with which we are undermining their future. And let me just refer back to what Greta Thunberg said at the Climate Action Summit in September. And she said it with anger, if you remember, in her voice. She said, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are nowhere in sight? I remember sitting there listening to this child of 16, she's now 17, and I had tears in my eyes as a grandmother, just listening to that voice of truth, to those assembled representatives of government who looked very sheepish, I have to say, very sheepish as she spoke, and some of them were quite annoyed because she is right. The climate crisis is worse than we think. It's getting worse more quickly than scientists had thought would happen. And the good news is that we have at last woken up, and it's not too late because of changes that are taking place, in particular in this sustainability area and in renewable energy becoming so competitive. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have to make it much more effective and implement what we committed to. So let's go back briefly to 2015. I was the special envoy of the Secretary General at the time. My deputy Ban Ki-moon was then my boss. And I observed the negotiations for the 2030 agenda. And I wear this badge, which I see quite a number of you are wearing, for the Sustainable Development Goals. It was amazing that 193 government representatives would come to this agreement on the 2030 agenda. But they did it because they knew it was voluntary. They could pick and choose. They could decide how much, and so we got the 2030 agenda. Then I was even more focused on the lead up to the Paris Agreement. And it was a treaty. But as the discussions went on, it became weaker. What was going to be proposed was being watered down. But the French, who had the presidency, decided to have all these informal ministerial meetings. And I couldn't understand why, because frankly, they were incredibly boring. Because every country repeated its lines. You knew what China was going to say, you knew what the US was going to say, it was Obama, but and Obama and President Xi had made it clear we were going to have a climate agreement, but they weren't, to say the least of it, overcommitting, either of them. And you had the European Union, but you had a voice for the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruyn, who became a really good friend during those negotiations. He's now sadly dead. But Tony kept saying, quite simply, do you want my country to go under? Do you want us no longer to be a sovereign people? We have to have 1.5 of the text. And then in Paris, you had the mantra in the street, 1.5 to stay alive. And the Paris Agreement came out with a goal of staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degrees. But of course, the scientists had never been asked to study that. So the Paris Agreement had to ask the scientists, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? And if we have to stay at 1.5, how do we do it? And that was the report in October 2018, which I think woke up the world in a real sense. Because the answer from the scientists was pretty clear. They said, there is a very big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. It's in that band of time that bad things will happen. The coral reefs will more or less disappear. The Arctic ice will more or less disappear. And the permafrost will melt hugely and throw up not just carbon, but methane, which is even more dangerous in the shorter term. So I believe that report and the subsequent report on biodiversity and the extinction of species that came out in May last year, as a consequence of these reports, we can no longer regard the 2030 agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement as voluntary or more or less voluntary in the case of the Paris Climate Agreement, and a matter for each member state to decide on its own. Instead, the full implementation of both has become imperative in order to secure a livable world for our children and grandchildren. And this requires a change of mindset at the global political level. The IPCC said we have to stay at 1.5 degrees, not just for small island states, but for the whole world. And that requires a reduction of 45% in carbon emissions, global carbon emissions, by 2030. And the scientists said it is doable if there is the political will. And as rightly been said already at this conference, 2020 is a very key year. We mustn't feel that it's the end of the end if Glasgow doesn't achieve as much as we would wish. Let's hope it really will be a breakthrough. But we mustn't put all our thoughts into, and then if it's a failure, we're all gone. That's not a good approach either. But how do we get that political will and sense of global solidarity? I believe it's through the emerging movement for climate justice that I mentioned. And it's heartening to see that women leaders are stepping forward, as well as school children and Extinction Rebellion, and increasingly business and finance, and calling for more commitment from governments. And the importance of this growing climate justice movement is that it will call for a just transition to a world powered by clean energy and climate actions that fully respect human rights. Workers in coal, oil and gas won't be left out. And indeed, with this move rapidly to electric cars, the announcement made this morning about more rapidly here in the United Kingdom, there will be losers in the car manufacturing too. They have to be part of a just transition. And priority will also have to be given to reaching the 1 billion people, basically, who still lack electricity, who don't switch the switch, and the 2.3 billion who cook with charcoal, wood, peat, or animal dung, and ingest indoor air pollution that kills millions each year. We have actually the off-grid lights, we have the mini systems, we have clean cook stoves that could transform the lives of a significant proportion of our world and enable them to take themselves out of poverty. So I usually urge audiences like this to take 3 steps. I know I probably don't have to urge any of you to take the first step, because I think being involved in sustainability, you're already there. But let me say what the first step is. It's to make the issue of the climate crisis personal in your life, and do something to reduce your own consumption emissions, such as energy conservation, better recycling, or change in your eating habits. I, about 2 years ago, announced that I was a pescatarian. I'd given up meat. In Ireland, that was, noted with some controversy by our beloved farming community, but it's important to do something personally. Secondly, having done this, the second thing is to get angry and take action. Again, you've probably already taken the second step to some extent. Get angry with those who have more responsibility, such as governments at all levels, including cities and towns, but also business, especially fossil fuel business, agribusiness, transport, etc. And then take action by using your voice and your vote, and by supporting organizations involved in conservation issues or climate change advocacy, which will also help your climate anxiety, help reduce it. The third step, I don't know that you're onto. And if you're not, I think it's the most important step at this stage. We must imagine the world that we need to be hurrying towards. We must imagine that world. It's going to be a clean energy world, so we won't have the pollution of our water and our air of fossil fuel. It's going to be a much healthier world. It has to be a much fairer world, because we'll have to have implemented the 2030 agenda with this leaving no one behind. So rising to the challenge of addressing the threat of climate change can be truly transformative. Out of this crisis, we can see an opportunity and do it in accordance with the 2030 agenda by leaving no one behind. We've entered a new reality where fossil fuel companies are losing their legitimacy and social license to operate. If governments are to retain their own legitimacy and trust among citizens, this means they must end all fossil fuel subsidies in all forms, so coal and other hydrocarbons are kept in the ground, and resources are invested instead in clean renewable energy sources and green technologies. There is a tendency for countries to know that the nationally determined contributions, which they have to increase the ambition of before Glasgow, they only refer to what's happening in a country. So a country can make a commitment to be zero carbon, or net zero carbon, or whatever way you want to put it, carbon neutrality by 2050, and be investing in oil and gas elsewhere. That's not good enough. That's what we have to hold them to, and hold them to very seriously. So what is the role of business in a practical sense? I actually saw business leadership in action before Paris. It was in Davos in January 2015, when the B team of business leaders who are linked to the elders, so I was there as an honorary B team member, if you like, and they made a commitment to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions in their corporations and in their supply chain, and do it the climate justice way with just transition. In January 2015. That was real leadership. Christiana Figueres was at the meeting, and she said, this is really what I want to see from business. We're seeing quite a move, and I'm really pleased, and maybe the way I can sum it up is, what happened at Davos this year, because there have been Davoses in between where there was a lot of talk and not much action. But I think this year there was a subtle difference. There were more commitments made at that level, and they mattered. I mean, we all heard about the trillion trees, because even President Trump tried to escape criticism by saying he would be supportive of that. But Klaus Schwab asked all Davos participants to set a net zero climate target. That wouldn't have happened until this year. The Climate Disclosure Project revealed its A-list of 179 companies who are leading on environmental performance and transparency. And there's a new fund starting at 100 million, the IDH Sustainable Trade Initiative, with a number of companies, big companies, which is an impact fund for small holder farmers. And the WEF itself launched the Reskilling Revolution platform to provide better jobs, education and skills to 1 billion people over the next 10 years. And even the big four accounting firms have signed up to Environmental Disclosure Scheme, which is the biggest effort for businesses to account for their social and environmental impact. So that is happening, which is good and which is necessary. But I think we have to see businesses go further. I think at this stage, business leaders must also speak up for a regulatory environment that protects all human rights, one that holds them accountable for their actions as well. And they must also do more to be transparent and accountable about their own activities, including their roles in partnerships to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Less green rinsing, or whatever it may be called, more measured, accountable, transparent activity. And I see the climate justice movement bottom up and business and investment top down, squeezing the middle. And who's in the middle? Governments. And they need squeezing before Glasgow, because they have to commit to much greater ambition in their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs. I want to tell you briefly about an experience I had last June of attending the second dialogue at the Vatican on the energy transition and care for our common home, which included the top executives from the world's leading oil and gas producers, and they were all there, ExxonMobil, BP, Total, all of them at the highest level, and their global investors, and some climate scientists and scholars. And in his address to the group at the end, Pope Francis said, and I think it's worth quoting him briefly, he said, "Your meeting has focused on three interrelated points. First, just transition. Second, carbon pricing. And third, transparency in reporting climate risk. These are three immensely complex issues, and I commend you for taking them up. Dear friends, time is running out. Deliberations must go beyond mere exploration of what can be done and concentrate on what needs to be done. We don't have the luxury of waiting for others to step forward or of prioritizing short-term economic benefits. The climate crisis requires our decisive action here and now, and the Church is fully committed to playing her part." The problem is, the statements were very weak on carbon pricing and on climate risk disclosure. And somehow, even the fact that they'd signed up, nobody kind of noticed. But in my conversations, and that was the first time I've had these kind of conversations with the heads of the oil and gas companies, they have no intention of changing. Because you make billions out of fossil fuel. You make millions out of clean energy. So how do you go from billions to millions? And I believe you don't do it without disruption. It actually won't happen without disruption. Now, disruption takes many, many forms. It's the whole movement of young people, etc. It's also Extinction Rebellion or Sunrise in the United States going further. But it's litigation, and it's shareholders asking the right questions in companies. It's particularly the investment voice saying, your risk is too great. You must move out of what is going to become stranded assets, etc. All of that language and discussion. And what are the practical steps for small and medium-sized businesses? Because they too will have to adapt and change. I'm glad to see that there are a lot of tools now, and I'm not as expert as some of you may be in this, but I'm impressed by the B Corp Climate Emergency Handbook, which outlines the business case for responding to the climate emergency. It gives an overview of risks and opportunities and 5 steps to get started on launching a response within the SME, including guidance on how to communicate internally, appoint a transition team, set climate-based targets, reimagine business models, and share transition stories. It also contains guidance about how to make the case to boards and key business departments, such as supply chain, legal and governance, and finance. Another one which I noted is the UK Climate Impacts Programme Climate Action Wizard Toolkit. That's a 5-step process to help SMEs assess their organization's vulnerability to current climate and future climate change, to identify options to address their organization's key climate risks, and help them develop and implement a climate change adaptation strategy. So they have a variety of tools and resources to help business with creating and implementing adaptation strategies. And I'm going to end with the responsibility that was put on all of the elders, and I now feel it particularly as chair, by Nelson Mandela when he brought us together in 2007. He said, be independent, work for peace and human rights, but above all else, bring hope. And I noted hope was one of the things that at least some of you wanted to get out of this conference. We need hope. I learned a wonderful lesson, which I want to just share with you briefly, from the then chair of the elders, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He and I was an elder at the time, he and I were in New York at a social good conference, which was a conference involving young people organized by the UN Foundation, and they were supposed to be on their iPads and their phones and tweeting, as you've been encouraged to do from this conference. And when Archbishop Tutu gets in front of young people, he shows his love, his belief in them, his support for and he was waving his arms. We were being moderated by an American journalist, and she said quite sharply, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he looked at her and he shook his head and he said, "Oh no, dearie, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope." And when you think of his life, the Commission on Justice and Peace, all of what he has lived through, we do need hope, because hope means that even if the glass isn't half full, if there's something in that glass, you work with it. I actually wrote a book sometime, which was published in 2018, on climate justice, which was stories. It's climate justice, hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future. 11 stories, 9 of them involve women, but there are also 2 good men. And it's all about those who are least responsible, most affected, but actually working to build resilience in their community and having that hope. And I would hope myself that one of the things that will charge your batteries going out of this conference is to feel this is a very difficult time. It's a crisis, but the crisis is also an opportunity. And with that opportunity, we have hope that we're actually going to do what is needed. And I have hope that you will. And I'm very ready to answer any questions if you have a few minutes. Thank you.